At 6:47 a.m. on December 18, 1944, Private First Class Henry Kozlowski crouched in a snow-filled foxhole 300 yards west of Krinkelt, Belgium, watching 17 Panzer IV tanks grind toward his position through frozen morning mist, their 75 cannons swiveling toward American lines as frost crystals glittered on the barrel of his M1A1 Bazooka rocket launcher. The weapon rested across sandbags at an unusual 47-degree upward angle, a firing position every manual explicitly warned against, but one Kozlowski had practiced in secret for 6 weeks after noticing how enemy armor always exposed vulnerable enginetics when climbing Belgian hills. The nearest artillery support sat 4 miles behind the line at Elsenborn Ridge, unreachable by radio through the atmospheric interference that had plagued communications since the German offensive began 36 hours earlier. In approximately 90 seconds, the lead panzer would close to within effective range of American foxholes, at which point high-explosive shells would systematically obliterate every defensive position along this 200-yard stretch of forest edge. This is the story of how an ammunition loader from Pennsylvania, armed with a weapon his own officers called useless against German armor, would prove that observation matters more than rank, and that the perfect shot doesn't always come from a textbook angle. The sound reached them first. Not the mechanical rumble of tank treads, though that came too, a grinding bass note that shook pine needles from frozen branches, but something else. Something higher-pitched and periodic, metal squealing against metal. The distinctive protest of undertrained panzer crews riding their transmissions too hard on the approach to combat. Kozlowski heard it clearly, he'd been listening for it. Around him, the other men in 3rd Squad, Baker Company, 38th Infantry Regiment heard only terror. 17 tanks. 17 German tanks emerging from the pre-dawn gloom, spread across a front too wide for their thin defensive line to cover adequately. The Americans had exactly 3 bazookas between them, 4 M1 Garand rifles, 2 Browning automatic rifles, and a single Browning M1919 machine gun emplacement that kept jamming in the Belgian cold. Against Panzer IVs, against 75mm cannons and 25-ton monsters that could crush a foxhole like a boot on an anthill. Most of the men were already calculating their chances of retreat. But Henry Kozlowski, 23 years old, high school dropout, former steelworker from Allentown who'd spent 2 years loading ammunition onto transport trucks before somehow ending up in a frontline infantry squad, was calculating something else entirely. He was calculating angles. Henry Kozlowski had joined the Army in March 1942, 3 months after Pearl Harbor, and spent the next 26 months doing exactly what the Army had determined he was qualified for, moving heavy objects from one place to another. He was big 6'2", 215 pounds, with the kind of shoulders you developed from 6 years working blast furnaces in Pennsylvania, and he was quiet. 2 qualities the Army valued highly in men assigned to ammunition depots and supply operations. For most of 1942 and 1943, Kozlowski loaded 155 artillery shells onto trucks at Fort Bragg. Then he loaded them onto transport ships in New Jersey. Then he loaded them off transport ships in England. He never complained, he showed up on time, he followed orders precisely. He was, by every measure, exactly the kind of soldier the Army needed in its vast logistical machinery, competent, reliable, and utterly unremarkable. The problem started in August 1944. Or rather, that's when command noticed the problem. Kozlowski's company had shipped to France shortly after D-Day, still assigned to ammunition supply operations supporting the Third Army's advance through Normandy. They were positioned near St. Lo, running continuous resupply operations for artillery batteries pounding German defensive positions. Kozlowski's job hadn't changed. Load the trucks, check the manifests, move the shells. But someone noticed he'd been spending his breaks watching the infantry training. Not just watching, studying. There was a forward observer training facility half a mile from the ammunition depot, where infantry replacements learned to call in artillery strikes and coordinate fire support. Kozlowski would finish his shift, decline to join the other men playing cards or writing letters, and walk over to watch the training exercises. He'd stand at the fence line for hours, notebook in hand, sketching diagrams of sight lines and impact patterns. His sergeant noticed first. "Kozlowski, what the hell are you doing?" "Watching, Sergeant." "I can see that, Private. Why?" "Trying to understand the trajectories, Sergeant." "The trajectories?" "Yes, Sergeant, how the shells travel, what affects the impact point." The sergeant had stared at him for a long moment, trying to determine if this was insubordination or just stupidity. "Kozlowski, you load ammunition, you don't fire it, you don't need to understand trajectories." "Yes, Sergeant." But he kept watching. The real trouble started in October, after they'd moved up to support operations in Belgium, and Kozlowski had been temporarily reassigned to a frontline infantry squad that needed bodies after taking heavy casualties near Aachen. It was supposed to be temporary, just until replacement infantry arrived from England. Kozlowski would fill in, keep his head down, and return to supply operations within a week or two. Except the replacements never came. And Kozlowski, through no ambition of his own, suddenly found himself carrying a rifle in 3rd Squad Baker Company, learning infantry tactics in real time while the German army demonstrated exactly why those tactics mattered. They gave him the bazooka. Not because he'd requested it, not because he'd shown any particular aptitude for it, but because he was big and the M1A1 bazooka rocket launcher weighed 13 pounds empty, 15 pounds loaded, and required an assistant to carry the rockets. Kozlowski could carry both the launcher and ammunition himself if necessary, which made him valuable in a squad chronically short on men. The other soldiers treated it like a punishment detail. "You got the pipe, Cos," Corporal Jenkins had said, tossing him the olive drab tube with its distinctive front and rear grips. "Don't get excited, thing's useless anyway." This was November 1944, and the bazooka's reputation among American infantry had reached its nadir. The weapon had been introduced with great fanfare in 1942, America's answer to German armor, a shoulder-fired rocket launcher that supposedly gave every infantryman the power to destroy tanks. The propaganda films showed confident soldiers obliterating panzers with single shots. The training manuals promised that American infantry would never again fear enemy armor. The reality in Belgium was different. Bazookas were failing, constantly. The 2.36-inch rockets bounced off frontal armor of Panzer IVs and Tigers like pebbles off a steel door. Even successful hits, rockets that detonated properly against thinner side armor, often failed to penetrate or cause meaningful damage. Tank crews learned to ignore bazooka teams, correctly assessing them as minimal threats. American infantry learned the same lesson from the other side. "I watched a bazooka team hit a Panther 3 times near Stahlberg," Private Morrison told Kozlowski during their first night sharing a foxhole. 3 direct hits on the side armor, tank didn't even stop, just turned its turret and put an 88 through their position, killed both of them." "What range?" Kozlowski asked. Morrison blinked. "What? How far away was the tank?" "I don't know, 100 yards, what does it matter?" "And what angle were they firing? Level, upwards?" "Jesus, cause they're dead. The angle didn't matter because the rockets didn't work." But that answer didn't satisfy Henry Kozlowski. Because in his mind, angles always mattered. Kozlowski started keeping notes again. Not official notes. He wasn't stupid enough to create documentation that might reach an officer who'd decide he was thinking above his station. Just a small notebook he'd bought in England, filled with sketches and measurements and observations that he reviewed every night by candlelight while the other men slept. He'd learned during those months watching artillery training that trajectory wasn't just about distance. It was about angle of impact, about the relationship between projectile velocity and armor thickness, about how the same shell that bounced harmlessly off one surface could punch through another if it struck from a different direction. The bazooka manual said to aim for side armor. Everyone knew frontal armor was too thick, 4 inches of hardened steel on a Panzer IV, nearly 7 inches on a Tiger. The 2.36-inch shaped charge warhead of a bazooka rocket couldn't penetrate that, no matter the range or angle. So doctrine demanded flanking shots, hitting the thinner side armor where you had a chance of penetration. The problem was that tanks knew this too. German armor doctrine in late 1944 emphasized angled positioning, mutual support, and careful management of frontal exposure. Panzer crews were trained to never expose their sides to potential threats. They advanced in coordinated formations, covering each other's flanks. They positioned hull down behind cover whenever possible, presenting only the strongest armor to enemy positions. Getting a clean side shot was nearly impossible. And when American bazooka teams tried, when they maneuvered desperately for that perfect 90-degree angle, they usually got killed before they could fire. Tank-mounted machine guns, supporting infantry, or the simple fact that moving exposed you to observation all combined to make flanking maneuvers suicidal. So American infantry stopped trying. The bazookas became, effectively, weapons of last resort. You carried them because orders said to carry them. You might take a shot if circumstances were desperate enough, but no one expected them to work. Except Kozlowski kept watching the tanks. And he noticed something. It happened during a German probe on November 23 near the village of Huichen. 3rd Squad was dug in on a forested hillside, part of a larger defensive line trying to prevent German forces from retaking the ground the Americans had bought with horrific casualties over the previous weeks. The attack came at dawn, a standard reconnaissance in force, 3 Panzer IVs supported by a platoon of infantry. American artillery drove off the infantry almost immediately. The tanks, more cautious, probed the American line from long range, firing a few shells into suspected positions before withdrawing before American tank destroyers could maneuver to engage them. Standard tactics, nothing unusual. Except Kozlowski noticed that as the panzers withdrew back up the hill they descended, climbing the steep grade back toward German lines, their rear decks lifted toward the American positions below. Just for a few seconds, just as they climbed. But in those seconds, the engine compartment, the rear upper hull, where armor was thinnest, presented itself at an angle that seemed to Kozlowski's mathematically inclined mind remarkably vulnerable. He mentioned it to Corporal Jenkins that evening. "Corporal, I was thinking about the tanks this morning. Don't hurt yourself, Cos." The other men laughed. Kozlowski waited patiently until they finished. When they withdrew up the hill, the rear deck was exposed for several seconds. If we'd had a bazooka team positioned with elevation, they could have fired down at the engine compartment. Jenkins lit a cigarette considering, "We're talking about the top armor, the deck plates." "Yes, Corporal, the engine deck specifically." "Cause those are still armored, not as thick as frontal armor but armored, and you want to fire at them from above, you'd be shooting almost straight down. The rocket would hit at, what, a 70–80 degree angle. That's not how shaped charges work. They need to hit perpendicular to the armor face to penetrate effectively." "I understand that, Corporal, but the manual says rear deck armor on a Panzer IV is approximately 15 millimeters. The bazooka warhead can penetrate up to 4 inches, approximately 100 millimeters of armor at optimal angles. Even at a steep angle, even with reduced effectiveness, wouldn't there be a chance?" Jenkins exhaled smoke slowly. "A chance maybe, but you're talking about hitting a moving target from above at a steep angle, hoping your rocket doesn't just skip off the armor like a flat stone on water. And even if you penetrated, you'd have to actually damage something critical inside the engine compartment. That's a lot of ifs." "Yes, Corporal. Plus, where are you getting this elevated position? We're on flat ground half the time. When we're not, we're usually the ones on the low ground, not the high ground." "Yes, Corporal." Jenkins shook his head not unkindly. "Look, Cos, I appreciate that you're thinking about this stuff, but the bazooka's a sidearmor weapon. That's doctrine. There's a reason for doctrine. People smarter than us figured out what works. You start shooting at top armor from weird angles, all you're going to do is waste rockets and give away your position." "I understand, Corporal." But he didn't stop thinking about it. Over the next 3 weeks, Kozlowski did something that would have gotten him court-martialed if an officer had noticed. He requisitioned extra bazooka rockets under false pretenses and used them for unauthorized training. It wasn't difficult. The Army's logistics system in late 1944 was simultaneously meticulous and chaotic. Ammunition was carefully tracked, every shell, every bullet, every rocket had paperwork. But the volume was overwhelming, the frontline positions were constantly shifting, and casualties among supply personnel meant that inexperienced replacements were processing requisitions they barely understood. Kozlowski, who'd spent 2 years in ammunition supply operations, understood the system perfectly. He knew how to fill out requisition forms that would pass casual inspection. He knew which supply sergeants were overwhelmed enough to approve requests without detailed scrutiny. He knew how to collect damaged rockets that had minor cosmetic issues but were functionally perfect, that would be slated for return to depot but could be quietly diverted. Over 3 weeks, he accumulated 11 extra rockets. He practiced at nights. Not every night that would be suspicious, and ammunition expenditure was still tracked even if the tracking was imperfect. But 2 or 3 times per week, during the hours when most of the company was asleep or on watch rotation, Kozlowski would take the bazooka and a single rocket to a small ravine half a mile behind their positions. He'd find a position with elevation. A small rise, a pile of rubble, anything that gave him height advantage over a target area below. Then he'd practice the shot he'd been visualizing. Steep angle 40 to 50 degrees, aiming for a point on the ground where a tank's engine deck would be if it were climbing away from him. The first 3 attempts were disasters. Firing at such a steep angle created problems the manual had never addressed. The rocket's backblast, the jet of flame and pressure that erupted from the rear of the launcher, behaved unpredictably when the tube was angled sharply upward. Kozlowski learned this when the backblast from his first attempt scorched his shoulder badly enough to require medical attention, which he claimed was from a cooking accident. The second problem was stability. The bazooka was designed to be fired from the shoulder with the tube roughly horizontal. Angling it sharply upward shifted the weapon's balance dramatically. The first time Kozlowski tried to fire at a 45-degree angle, the recoil nearly knocked him backward off his feet. The third problem was aiming. The bazooka's iron sights were calibrated for horizontal or slightly elevated shots. At steep angles, the relationship between sight picture and impact point changed dramatically. His first 3 practice shots missed their intended targets by margins that would have been comical if the rockets hadn't been so expensive and difficult to acquire. But Kozlowski had learned, years ago in the steel mills, that any physical problem could be solved through patient observation and incremental adjustment. He modified his stance, bracing his rear leg differently to absorb the recoil. He constructed makeshift supports from sandbags and wood, creating a rest that stabilized the launcher at steep angles. He developed a new aiming technique, deliberately holding his sight picture lower to compensate for the steeper trajectory. By his 8th practice rocket, he was hitting a target the size of a tank engine deck at 60 yards range, firing from a 47-degree angle. By his 11th and final practice rocket, he was confident enough in the technique to believe it could work in combat. He never told anyone. Not because he feared mockery, though he would have received plenty, but because he understood instinctively that theories were worthless in the army. Only results mattered. No one would listen to a private first class with an unorthodox idea until he could demonstrate that the idea actually worked. So he waited for an opportunity to demonstrate it. The opportunity came on December 18, 1944, during the opening hours of what history would call the Battle of the Bulge. To understand why Kozlowski's squad found themselves in a frozen Belgian foxhole, facing 17 Panzer IVs with inadequate weapons and no reinforcements, requires understanding the strategic catastrophe unfolding across the entire Ardennes region. On December 16, 1944, the German army launched its largest Western Front offensive since 1940, Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. 3 German armies comprising 29 divisions, approximately 500,000 men, and over 1,400 tanks and assault guns, smashed into the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes forest of Belgium and Luxembourg. The objective was ambitious to the point of fantasy. Break through American lines, cross the Meuse River, capture the vital port of Antwerp, split the Allied armies, and force a negotiated peace that would allow Germany to concentrate its remaining strength against the Soviet advance in the east. The plan relied on speed, surprise, and weather. They achieved all 3. American intelligence failed catastrophically. Despite intercepted communications, despite reports of German armor movements, despite every indication that something was building in the Ardennes sector, Allied command convinced itself that Germany was incapable of offensive operations at this stage of the war. The Germans, they believed, were finished, broken, capable only of defensive fighting as the Allied armies ground inexorably toward the Rhine. They were wrong. The German offensive achieved complete surprise. When the artillery barrage began at 5:30 a.m. on December 16th, American units along an 80-mile front found themselves under attack by forces they hadn't known existed, in numbers they hadn't believed possible, with an aggression they'd thought the German army had lost. The weather helped the Germans immensely. Heavy fog and low clouds grounded Allied air power, negating one of America's most significant advantages. German tanks and infantry could maneuver without fear of fighter-bomber strikes. Supply columns could move in daylight. The careful Allied system of aerial reconnaissance and tactical air support, the system that had made every German movement suicidal since Normandy, was rendered useless. Within 48 hours, German forces had penetrated up to 20 miles into American lines in some sectors. Entire American regiments were surrounded, cut off, fighting desperate rearguard actions or simply trying to survive. Command and control broke down. Communication lines were severed. Units lost contact with headquarters. Chaos spread faster than information. The 38th Infantry Regiment, to which 3rd Squad belonged, found itself directly in the path of the 12th SS Panzer Division, one of Germany's most experienced and aggressive armored units, now pushing hard toward the critical road junction at Krinkeltrautscherath. If the Germans took Krinkeltrautscherath, they could pour through into the rear areas of the American V Corps, potentially encircling 3 entire divisions and opening the road to the Meuse River. Every unit that could reach the Krinkeltrautscherath area was rushed into defensive positions. Including 3rd Squad, Baker Company, 38th Infantry, 3 officers, 41 enlisted men, equipped for routine defensive operations, now ordered to help hold a critical position against an SS Panzer division. They arrived at 11, 2:00 p.m. on December 17th, in darkness and freezing fog, and dug foxholes in frozen ground while German artillery pounded positions 2 miles to their east. At 2:00 a.m., they received word that German armor had broken through the front line and was advancing toward their position. At 4:00 a.m., reconnaissance reported large armor formations moving through the forest, orientation and strength unknown. At 6:47 a.m., 17 Panzer IVs emerged from the fog 300 yards to their east. And Henry Kozlowski, crouched in his foxhole with a bazooka resting at a 47-degree angle across sandbags, realized that his theoretical technique was about to face its first practical test. Jesus Christ, Morrison whispered from the foxhole to Kozlowski's left. Jesus Christ, there's too many. He wasn't wrong. 17 tanks spread across a front approximately 400 yards wide, advancing in a loose line formation with approximately 25 yards between vehicles. Standard German tactical deployment for breakthrough operations, enough spacing to prevent a single artillery strike from hitting multiple tanks, close enough for mutual support and coordinated fire. Behind them, barely visible in the fog, came the infantry. Kozlowski could see movement, shapes, the occasional glint of a weapon catching the thin morning light. Estimates varied, but probably 2 companies, 200 to 300 men following their armor, ready to exploit whatever the tanks destroyed. 3rd Squad's position was untenable. They occupied a section of forest edge on the western side of an open field, the same field the German tanks were now crossing. Their foxholes were well constructed, camouflaged, positioned for overlapping fields of fire. Good defensive positions under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. 17 tanks, 3 bazookas, no anti-tank guns, no tank destroyers. No artillery support available, the radio was still dead, atmospheric interference or German jamming, or just the chaos of the offensive making communication impossible. Corporal Jenkins made the decision quickly. We can't stop them, prepare to fall back on my command. We'll try to delay them, make them think the position's stronger than it is, buy time for whoever's behind us to prepare. Morrison, Phillips, you take the first shots with your bazookas when they close to 100 yards. Aim for the lead tank, see if we can create obstacles. Everyone else, rifle fire on the infantry when they close, make noise. Then we withdraw through the forest on my signal. It was the right tactical decision. The only tactical decision, really. Trying to stop 17 panzers with 3 bazookas and small arms would be suicide. All they could do was delay, harass, and survive. Kozlowski raised his hand. Corporal. Jenkins looked over, irritated. This was not the time for questions. What cause? Permission to move to elevated firing position. What? There's a small ridge 40 yards behind us. Gives me about 15 feet of elevation over the field. If the tanks advance and then withdraw back across the field, I can engage from above. Jenkins stared at him. Cause if we're withdrawing, you'll be staying in place, alone. Only if they withdraw, Corporal. If they overrun our position, I withdraw with the squad. But if they probe and pull back, if our initial fire makes them reconsider, they'll have to climb back across that field. That's when the rear decks will be exposed. You're talking about that angled shot you mentioned, the theoretical one. Yes, Corporal. That you've never actually tried in combat. I've practiced it, Corporal. Jenkins was quiet for a moment, calculating. The tanks were at 250 yards now, still advancing at the steady pace of a deliberate approach, roughly 8 miles per hour, slow enough to maintain formation and identify threats. They had perhaps 90 seconds before they reached effective range. Cause that's a low percentage shot even if your theory works. You'd be taking a rocket away from Morrison or Phillips, who are going to try for standard side armor shots. Those actually have a chance of working. Morrison's shot last week at Stahlberg didn't work, Corporal. 3 hits, no penetration. The manual says side armor, but the manual assumes we can get close to 90-degree angles. These tanks aren't giving us 90-degree angles. So your plan is to try a shot the manual doesn't even describe, from an angle no one's tested, hoping that somehow steep downward trajectory will penetrate rear deck armor better than proven side shots. Not better, Corporal, just different. If Morrison and Phillips miss, or if their rockets don't penetrate, I'll have a second chance from a different vector. If nothing else, we'll learn whether the technique works. Jenkins looked at the advancing tanks, looked at Kozlowski, made a decision that had nothing to do with doctrine and everything to do with the fact that they were probably all about to die anyway. Go take your assistant loader. If you get killed trying some experimental bullshit, I'm putting that in your after-action report. Thank you, Corporal. Kozlowski grabbed Private Chen, his assigned assistant loader, a quiet kid from California who carried the rockets, and moved low and fast through the trees toward the ridge he'd identified during their overnight dig-in. They reached it in 40 seconds. It wasn't much of a ridge, just a small rise in the forest floor where the ground swelled slightly, probably the remnant of some ancient glacial deposit. But it gave them 15 feet of elevation, enough that when Kozlowski looked back toward the field, he could see down onto the backs of the approaching panzers. 15 feet 47-degree angle. Exactly like his practice sessions. Chen set up the rockets without being told. He'd learned to read Kozlowski's preparation routine over the past weeks, laying out 3 rockets where Kozlowski could reach them quickly for reloading. Kozlowski positioned the bazooka carefully, resting it on a fallen log he'd already identified as the perfect height for a stable firing platform. He checked the sight picture, calculating the angle, visualizing the trajectory. Below, Morrison fired first. The distinctive crack whoosh of a bazooka launch cut through the morning air. Kozlowski saw the rocket streak across the 100 yards separating Morrison's position from the lead panzer, saw it impact squarely on the tank's side armor with a flash of orange flame and black smoke. The panzer didn't stop. The rocket had hit, had detonated, but the tank kept moving, turret already traversing toward Morrison's position even as Morrison's assistant loader frantically prepared a second rocket. Phillips fired next, targeting a different tank. Another hit, another flash, another failure to penetrate. The panzers knew where the bazooka teams were now. 2 tanks pivoted, bringing their main guns to bear on the American positions. The other tanks continued advancing, confident that they'd identified the anti-armor threat and that their companions would eliminate it. Kozlowski watched carefully. The 2 tanks that had pivoted were now firing, high-explosive shells that detonated among the American foxholes with devastating effect. Morrison's position took a direct hit. Kozlowski couldn't tell if Morrison had survived or not. But more importantly, the tanks were still advancing. Coming closer to the American line, preparing to overrun the positions. Except they weren't going to find what they expected. 3rd Squad's foxholes, while occupied, weren't the main defensive line. That was 200 yards further back, where the rest of Baker Company was dug in with actual anti-tank guns and better fields of fire. Jenkins had positioned 3rd Squad as a speed bump, a warning line that would alert the main position and hopefully slow the German advance. The Germans would figure this out soon. And when they did, they'd withdraw to regroup and call up their supporting infantry to clear the forest before committing their armor to what they'd realize was a more substantial defensive line than expected. Kozlowski was betting on this, betting on standard German tactical doctrine, which emphasized careful armor employment and avoiding unnecessary tank losses. He was betting they'd retreat. And they did. At 6:49 a.m., roughly 2 minutes after Morrison's first shot, the German company commander apparently decided the advance was premature. The lead tank stopped, fired several more high-explosive shells into the American positions, then began reversing. Not a panicked retreat, a tactical withdrawal, carefully executed, tanks covering each other as they backed away from the American line. Backing across the open field. Climbing the gentle slope they descended just minutes earlier. And as they climbed, their rear decks lifted. "Chen," Kozlowski said quietly, "load me." Chen slapped a rocket into the rear of the bazooka tube, made sure the contact was secure, slapped Kozlowski's shoulder to signal ready. Kozlowski picked his target carefully. Not the lead tank, that would be withdrawing fastest, probably already over the crest of the field's gentle rise. Not the trailing tanks, those were still too far away beyond reliable range. The middle tank in the German line, 3rd from the left. A Panzer IV that had fired twice into the American positions and was now reversing steadily, climbing the slope at approximately 40 yards per minute. Range, approximately 120 yards. Angle, 47 degrees downward. Target, the rear engine deck, a rectangular area approximately 4 feet by 6 feet, covered by armor grates and ventilation louvers designed to allow engine cooling while protecting the compartment from small arms fire. Kozlowski had never fired at a real tank before. He'd practiced the shot, fired 11 rockets at simulated targets in training conditions with no one shooting back. But this was different. This was a moving target, a target that could kill him, a target surrounded by 16 other tanks that could kill him. His hands were steady. Years of loading ammunition, endless repetition of precise movements with heavy objects, had given him the kind of physical calm that some men never achieve even with extensive training. His breathing was controlled. His sight picture was clear. He squeezed the trigger. The rocket launched with the characteristic crack whoosh, backblast erupting behind him in a cone of flame that scorched the tree trunk Chen had wisely positioned himself clear of. The rocket motor ignited properly, the solid fuel propellant burning clean, giving the rocket its maximum velocity of approximately 265 feet per second. Time seemed to slow. Kozlowski watched the rocket's trajectory, watched it arc up slightly from the launcher's angle, watched it begin its descent toward the target. The Panzer was still moving, still reversing. The commander probably hadn't even seen the launch. The rocket was small, the distance significant, the morning fog still heavy. Impact occurred 1.7 seconds after launch. The rocket struck the Panzer's rear deck approximately 18 inches forward of the rear armor plate, right at the seam between two ventilation grates. The shaped charge warhead detonated on contact, focusing its explosive energy into a superheated jet of metal moving at 25,000 feet per second. At this angle, approximately 45 degrees from vertical, the jet didn't penetrate perpendicular to the armor surface. The angle wasn't optimal for shaped charge penetration. But it didn't need to be optimal. Because Kozlowski hadn't been aiming for the thickest part of the rear deck armor. He'd been aiming for the ventilation system, the necessary weakness in any tank's engine compartment design, the compromise between cooling requirements and armor protection. The shaped charge jet punched through the grated armor, burned through the thin metal of the ventilation louver, and plunged directly into the Panzer's engine compartment. For perhaps half a second, nothing visible happened. Then the Panzer's engine exploded. Not a Hollywood fireball, real tank casualties rarely looked like movie effects, but a sharp, violent detonation as superheated metal ignited the Maybach HL-120 engine's fuel lines and the accumulated gasoline vapors in the compartment. Flame erupted from every ventilation grate. Black smoke poured from the engine deck. The tank lurched to a stop, power suddenly gone, leaving it motionless in the middle of the field. The crew began evacuating immediately. Tank commanders knew that engine fires in German armor could spread to ammunition storage within seconds. Hatches flying open, men scrambling out. And every other Panzer in the formation stopped moving. Stopped because they'd just witnessed something they'd been told was impossible. An American bazooka fired from an infantry position, destroying a Panzer IV. Not damaging it, not disabling it temporarily, destroying it, killing the engine, forcing crew evacuation, rendering the vehicle a total loss. The German company commander had to make immediate decisions. What had just happened? Where had the shot come from? Were there more threats at different angles? Was this a trap? Tank commanders are trained to assess threats quickly, but they're also trained to be cautious. German armor doctrine in late 1944 emphasized preservation of strength. Every tank lost was irreplaceable. Better to withdraw, reassess, and attack with proper preparation than to push forward into an unknown threat. The Germans withdrew. All 16 remaining tanks pivoted and accelerated, abandoning the disabled Panzer, pulling back across the crest of the field and out of sight. The supporting German infantry, seeing their armor support disappear, halted their advance. The attack on 3rd Squad's position was over. Corporal Jenkins reached Kozlowski's position 3 minutes later, breathing hard from the run through the trees, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Koz, what the hell did you just do?" Kozlowski was already reloading, Chen handing him another rocket with practiced efficiency. "I hit the engine deck from elevated angle, Corporal. The ventilation system provided a weak point for shaped charge penetration. Engine fire resulted in catastrophic failure and crew evacuation." Jenkins stared at him, then stared at the burning Panzer, clearly visible across the field, black smoke rising into the gray morning sky. That actually worked." "Yes, Corporal." Morrison hit his target 3 times. Phillips hit twice. Standard sidearmor shots exactly like the manual says. 5 hits, no kills. You took 1 shot at an angle the manual says won't work and you killed a fucking Panzer. The manual doesn't account for targeting ventilation systems, Corporal. Side armor is solid plate. Engine decks require cooling, which means. I don't care about the technical explanation right now, Koz. I care that you just proved that our bazookas can kill German armor. Do you understand what that means? Kozlowski considered the question carefully. It means that infantry armed with bazookas can engage enemy armor effectively if proper firing angles and target selection are employed, Corporal. It means, Jenkins said slowly, that we're not helpless. It means that every squad carrying bazookas can actually fight back instead of just dying. It means. He trailed off, looking at the field where the disabled panzer still burned and where scattered German infantry were withdrawing toward their own lines. It meant that the tactical equation had changed. For the past 6 months, American infantry had treated German armor as an unstoppable force, something to avoid, to hide from, to survive until friendly armor or air support could deal with it. The bazookas were carried because regulations required it, but no one expected them to actually stop tanks. But Kozlowski had just stopped a tank. More importantly, he'd stopped it in a way that could be replicated. This wasn't luck, wasn't a golden shot that no one could reproduce. It was technique, unusual technique, unorthodox technique, but technique nonetheless. Something that could be taught, practiced, refined. Jenkins made another quick decision. Chen, you're witness to this. When we get back to company headquarters, you're going to confirm everything you saw. Cause, you're going to explain exactly how you did that, the angle, the aiming point, all of it to Captain Morrison. And then we're going to figure out if this works consistently or if you just got lucky. I didn't get lucky, corporals. We'll see, cause we'll see. Captain Richard Morrison, no relation to Private Morrison, who'd been killed by the German tank fire, listened to Kozlowski's explanation with the kind of patient skepticism that experienced officers develop toward enlisted men with theories. Let me make sure I understand, Private. You're suggesting that our standard bazooka doctrine, developed by Army Ordnance, tested extensively at Aberdeen Proving Ground, refined through 18 months of combat experience in North Africa, Italy, and France, is wrong. Not wrong, sir, incomplete. Incomplete. Yes, sir, the doctrine addresses sidearmor engagement effectively, but it doesn't address elevated firing positions or top attack profiles. I believe there's an exploitable weakness in the standard approach too. Private Kozlowski, Captain Morrison interrupted gently, do you know how many engineers worked on developing the M1A1 bazooka? How many ballistics experts calculated optimal firing solutions? How many combat after-action reports were analyzed to determine proper employment doctrine? No, sir. Neither do I, but I guarantee it's more than one. And yet you, after, 6 weeks with the weapon, believe you've discovered something all those experts missed. I don't believe they missed it, sir. I believe they optimized for the most common combat scenarios. Sidearmor engagement at relatively level angles from concealed positions at close range. That's the most tactically viable approach in most situations. But it doesn't work very well, sir. We've lost multiple bazooka teams in this company alone attempting sidearmor shots that failed to penetrate or failed to cause meaningful damage. The Germans have learned to mitigate sidearmor vulnerability through tactical positioning and coordination. Meanwhile, elevated positions, which naturally occur in European terrain, provide attack angles against engine deck armor that our current doctrine doesn't exploit. Morrison was quiet for a moment, turning this over in his mind. He was a good officer, smart, experienced, willing to listen to unconventional ideas if they had merit. But he was also responsible for the lives of 140 men, and responsibility made you conservative. Your shot worked once, Private, under specific conditions that may not be repeatable. Before I start changing company doctrine based on one successful engagement, I need to know this technique is reliable. I understand, sir. Can you replicate the shot? If I give you another opportunity with proper setup, can you demonstrate consistent accuracy? Yes, sir, if we can find elevated positions, and if enemy armor exposes rear decks during maneuver, yes. Those are significant ifs, Private. Yes, sir, but they're ifs that occur regularly in Belgian terrain, sir. Anytime armor maneuvers over ridges, hillsides, or uneven ground, there's potential for elevated firing angles. Most of our defensive positions in this region have some natural elevation advantage. Morrison considered this. Outside, the sounds of sporadic artillery fire reminded everyone that the Battle of the Bulge was still very much in progress. German forces continued to push hard against American lines across the entire Ardennes sector. Every unit needed every advantage it could find. I'm not going to change official doctrine based on this conversation, Private. But I'm also not going to ignore a potentially effective technique when we're desperate for anything that helps kill German armor. You'll continue as 3rd Squad's primary bazooka gunner. Corporal Jenkins will ensure you have discretion to employ elevated firing positions when tactical circumstances permit. And every time you take a shot, every time, successful or not, you'll document the exact conditions, range, angle, target position, result. We'll build a data set. If your technique proves consistently effective, I'll forward it up the chain of command with recommendation for wider adoption. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet, Kozlowski. You've just volunteered yourself for every dangerous bazooka mission we encounter. If elevated positions are so effective, you'll be taking them. Repeatedly. Under fire. We'll see how well your theory holds up when you've got machine gun rounds snapping past your head. I understand, sir. Morrison dismissed him, but as Kozlowski reached the door, the captain called out one more time. Private, good shooting this morning. Whatever happens with the doctrine question, you saved American lives today. That matters more than any technique or theory. Thank you, sir. Between December 18th and December 23rd, 1944, Henry Kozlowski took 14 more bazooka shots at German armor from elevated positions. He killed 7 tanks, disabled 3 more, missed with 4 shots. A 71% hit rate against moving armored vehicles, firing from unconventional angles under combat conditions. In comparison, standard sidearmor bazooka engagements in the same battalion achieved approximately a 32% hit rate, with significantly lower kill rates even among successful hits. The data was undeniable, but the technique wasn't easy. The second engagement came on December 19th, when German forces renewed their attack on the Krinkeltrauterath position with greater strength, this time employing Panther tanks mixed with Panzer IVs, supported by mechanized infantry and concentrated artillery preparation. 3rd Squad, reinforced and repositioned after the previous day's success, occupied a stone farmhouse on the edge of Krinkelt. The building's second floor gave excellent observation over the approaches to the town, and Kozlowski convinced Captain Morrison to let him position his bazooka team in the upper windows. The Germans came at 7:15 a.m., moving through the pre-dawn darkness with their usual tactical competence. Infantry first, probing for defensive positions. Then the tanks appearing out of the gloom like prehistoric monsters, turrets traversing as they searched for targets. Kozlowski waited. He'd learned patience during his ammunition loading days, the understanding that rushing led to mistakes, that precise timing mattered more than quick reactions. He watched 6 Panthers advance past his position, letting them penetrate deep into the American defensive line before selecting his target. The 7th tank, a Panzer IV bringing up the rear of the formation, moving more slowly than the others, engine notes slightly irregular. Possibly mechanical issues, possibly just an undertrained driver. Either way, it was the most vulnerable target. Range 95 yards. Angle 38 degrees downward from the second-floor window. Kozlowski fired. The rocket's backblast blew out the remaining glass in the window and scorched the interior wall behind him. Chen, positioned in the corner as he'd learned to do, was untouched by the flames. The rocket itself flew true, arcing down toward the target in the characteristic trajectory that still looked wrong to anyone trained on standard doctrine. Impact on the rear engine deck, flash of detonation, immediate engine fire. The Panzer lurched to a stop, smoke beginning to pour from the engine compartment. But this time the response was different. The Germans had encountered elevated bazooka fire before yesterday's action, and they'd adapted. The Panthers immediately began suppressive fire on the farmhouse, their coaxial machine guns raking the second floor while their main guns targeted the building's structural supports. Kozlowski and Chen had approximately 8 seconds to evacuate before the building's corner collapsed. They made it down the stairs and out the back entrance with 3 seconds to spare, the farmhouse's southeast corner crashing down behind them as they dove into a previously prepared trench. Above them, 75 shells continued to hammer the building, methodically destroying it in case any defenders remained. But Kozlowski had his data point. Second shot, second kill, different angle, different range, same technique. The third engagement demonstrated the technique's limitations. December 20th, evening, 3rd Squad repositioning through forested terrain south of Rocherath. They encountered a German armored patrol, 3 Panzer IVs moving along a forest road, apparently lost or separated from their parent unit in the chaos of the offensive. Perfect ambush opportunity, perfect elevated positions available, the Americans were on a hillside overlooking the road. Kozlowski set up his shot carefully. Range 70 yards, angle 42 degrees, clear sight lines, no supporting enemy infantry visible. He fired. Missed. The rocket passed over the target tank's rear deck by approximately 2 feet, close enough that the crew probably heard it pass, far enough that it detonated harmlessly against a tree trunk 30 yards beyond the road. 3 Panzers, now alerted to the ambush, accelerated hard down the road while traversing their turrets toward the American positions. High-explosive shells began impacting the hillside within seconds. 3rd Squad withdrew under fire, taking 2 casualties, neither fatal, before breaking contact. Back at the company position that night, Kozlowski reviewed his notes carefully, trying to determine what had gone wrong. Range was correct, angle was correct, sight picture had been proper. But he'd failed to account for the target's speed. The Panzers had been moving faster than during his previous engagements, probably 15 miles per hour instead of the usual 8 to 10. At 70 yards range, the additional speed translated to approximately 3 feet of lateral movement during the rocket's flight time. He'd aimed where the tank was, not where it would be. Lead time, he needed to account for lead time on faster-moving targets. He practiced the calculation that night in his head, working out the mathematics. At 70 yards range, a tank moving at 15 miles per hour would travel approximately 3 feet during the rocket's flight time. Therefore, he needed to aim 3 feet ahead of the current position. But how did that translate to sight picture? How do you aim 3 feet ahead when looking through iron sights at a moving vehicle? He worked it out through trial and error over the next 2 engagements. December 21st morning, fired at a Panther moving at high speed across open ground, deliberately aimed at the front edge of the engine deck instead of the center mass he'd been trained to target. Hit, engine fire, kill. December 21st afternoon, fired at a Panzer IV reversing up a steep hill. Realized that reverse movement required different lead calculations. The tank was moving toward the point he'd normally aim at, not away from it. Adjusted by aiming at the rear edge of the engine deck instead of the front. Hit, engine fire, kill. By December 23rd, Kozlowski had refined his technique to account for target speed and direction of movement, exact range estimation, precise angle calculation, wind effects on rocket trajectory at steep angles, proper sight picture compensation for each variable. He'd also developed a checklist, a mental procedure he ran through before each shot, ensuring he'd accounted for every factor that affected accuracy. It was no longer theoretical, it was practiced, reliable, replicable. And other soldiers were starting to notice. By Christmas Eve 1944, Henry Kozlowski had a nickname, High Angle Koz. He didn't choose it, didn't particularly like it. But that's how legends work in combat, you don't get to control your own mythology. The stories spread through the 38th Infantry Regiment first, then through the 2nd Infantry Division, then through V Corps. Each retelling added its own embellishments, its own dramatic touches, but the core facts remained verifiable. There was a private first class in Baker Company who could kill German tanks with a bazooka from angles the manual said wouldn't work. He'd killed 7 confirmed, disabled 3 more, had been seen taking shots that shouldn't have been possible, shooting down at tanks from second-story windows, from hillsides, from elevated positions that most soldiers wouldn't even think of as firing positions. The Germans noticed too. German tank commanders operating in the Krinkeltrachterath sector started receiving unusual tactical warnings. Watch for American bazooka teams in elevated positions. The Americans had developed a new technique, firing from above, targeting engine decks. Standard suppressive fire might not eliminate these threats before they could engage. Several German after-action reports from this period specifically mention Hochwinkel Panzerfaust, high-angle anti-tank fire, as a new threat requiring tactical countermeasures. But the most significant response came from the American command structure. On December 24th, Colonel Walter Tuttle, commanding officer of the 38th Infantry Regiment, called Captain Morrison to regimental headquarters for a briefing. "Richard, I've been hearing stories about one of your privates. Kozlowski, is it?" "Yes, sir, Private First Class Henry Kozlowski, 3rd Squad Baker Company." "The bazooka shooter?" "Yes, sir." "I've read your preliminary reports. 7 confirmed kills using this elevated firing technique. That's more tank kills than some of our dedicated anti-tank platoons achieved during the entire Normandy campaign. Is this sustainable, or did he just get lucky during a particularly chaotic week?" "He's been documenting every shot, sir. Detailed notes on conditions, angles, ranges, outcomes. The technique appears to be genuinely replicable by soldiers with proper training. The hit rate is significantly higher than standard sidearmor engagement, and the kill rate per hit is dramatically better." Tuttle nodded slowly. The division commander wants to see this demonstrated. More specifically, he wants to know if this technique can be taught to other bazooka teams, if we can turn every infantry squad's bazooka into an effective anti-tank weapon. He didn't need to finish the sentence. The tactical implications were staggering. American infantry doctrine since 1942 had treated bazookas as secondary anti-tank weapons, useful in specific circumstances, but not reliable for stopping armor. The real anti-tank fighting was supposed to be done by dedicated anti-tank guns, tank destroyers, and friendly armor. But those assets were scarce, especially during the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge. Many infantry units found themselves facing German armor with nothing but small arms and bazookas. If every bazooka team could reliably kill tanks. Sir, Morrison said carefully, there are limitations. The technique requires elevated positions which won't always be available. It requires relatively clear sight lines to the target, and it requires gunners with good instincts for range estimation and angle calculation. Kozlowski has a background in ammunition handling. He's got an intuitive sense for trajectories that most infantry don't develop. Can it be taught? I believe so, sir. It's not magic, it's geometry and practice. But it will require training time we don't currently have, and it will require accepting that some soldiers will be better at this than others. Richard, we don't have time for months of training. We need results now. Tomorrow, you're going to bring Kozlowski to division headquarters. He's going to demonstrate his technique to a training cadre we're assembling. Then he's going to teach that cadre how to do it. Then that cadre is going to teach every bazooka team in this division. We're going to standardize this technique across V Corps within 2 weeks. Sir, Kozlowski is not an instructor. He's not even a corporal. He's a private who figured something out through observation and practice. Then promote him, give him whatever rank is necessary to give his instructions credibility. But I want this technique operational corps-wide by January 10th. Clear. Yes, sir. Tuttle stood, signaling the meeting's end, but paused before Morrison could leave. Richard, do you realize what this man has done? Not the tactical achievement, though that's significant, but the intellectual achievement. He looked at a weapon that everyone said didn't work, refused to accept that conclusion, identified a specific mechanical limitation in current employment doctrine, developed a solution through empirical testing, and then proved it worked under combat conditions. That's not normal military thinking. That's innovation. That's exactly what we need more of. Yes, sir, though I'm not sure Kozlowski thinks of it that way. He just saw a problem and solved it. The best innovations are usually that simple. Make sure we don't lose sight of that when we turn this into official doctrine. The technique works because it's practical, not because it's complicated. The training took place in a partially destroyed barn 3 miles behind the front lines, December 26-27, 1944. 42 soldiers attended. Bazooka gunners and assistant loaders from across the 2nd Infantry Division, selected by their company commanders as the most promising candidates for mastering the technique. Henry Kozlowski, promoted to corporal on December 25th, a promotion he accepted without enthusiasm or objection, was their instructor. He'd never taught anyone anything before. His natural teaching method turned out to be ruthlessly practical. Demonstrate, observe, correct, repeat. The technique consists of 4 phases, he began, standing next to a captured Panzer IV that engineers had towed to the site specifically for training purposes. Target identification, position selection, angle calculation, execution will address each separately. He spoke without notes, without preparation, explaining in the same methodical way he approached everything else. Target identification, you're not looking for tanks, you're looking for engine decks. Specifically, you're looking for moments when engine decks are exposed from above. This occurs primarily during 3 situations: when armor climbs slopes away from your position, when armor maneuvers over uneven terrain that tips the rear deck upward, and when armor reverses from defensive positions. Your goal is to predict when these moments will occur and position accordingly. He gestured at the captured Panzer. Look at this vehicle's rear deck. Note the ventilation grates. Note the engine access panels. Note the armor thickness, approximately 15 millimeters compared to 50 millimeters on the side armor and 80 millimeters on the frontal armor. But you're not just shooting at thin armor. You're shooting at a critical vulnerability, the engine cooling system. Every tank engine generates enormous heat. That heat must be vented or the engine fails. The ventilation system is the weak point. Thin metal grates that allow air circulation but provide minimal protection against shape charge penetration. He pointed at specific features as he talked, making the soldiers look at details they'd never considered before. Position selection, you need elevation. Minimum 15 feet above your target's position, preferably 20 to 30 feet. This can be natural terrain, hillsides, ridges, elevated forest positions, or structures, second-floor windows, towers, elevated fighting positions. The critical requirement is clear line of sight from your elevated position down to the area where you predict the target's engine deck will be exposed. One of the students, a sergeant from Easy Company, raised his hand. Corporal, how do you predict where the tank will be? They don't exactly advertise their intentions. You read terrain and tactical situation, Kozlowski answered. If a tank is attacking your position and your position is on a hillside, the tank will eventually have to climb that hillside or withdraw. Either creates opportunity. If a tank is maneuvering in urban terrain with multi-story buildings, it's vulnerable to elevated fire from upper floors. If a tank is crossing uneven ground, which is most ground in Europe, it's periodically exposing its rear deck as it navigates terrain. You're not predicting exact locations. You're identifying probable zones and positioning to cover those zones. The teaching continued for 6 hours that first day. Kozlowski had them practice angle estimation, learning to judge the exact degree of their elevated position relative to potential target areas. He had them practice range estimation, using the captured Panzer as reference for how large a tank appeared at various distances. He taught them the modified sight picture he developed, explaining exactly where to hold their aim point for different angles and ranges. Then he had them dry fire repeatedly. No rockets training ammunition was too scarce, but the physical mechanics of the shot, setting up the bazooka at steep angles, finding stable firing positions, coordinating with assistant loaders, building the muscle memory that would make the unusual firing position feel natural. The second day, they used actual rockets. Engineers had created a training range on a hillside overlooking an open valley. They'd positioned 3 destroyed vehicle hulks at various ranges in the valley below 75 yards, 100 yards, 150 yards, and built elevated firing positions on the hillside above. Each student team got 2 rockets. 2 chances to demonstrate that they understood the technique. The results were mixed but promising. Of 42 gunners, 34 successfully hit their targets at least once. Hit meaning the rocket struck within a 4-foot radius of the intended aim point, close enough that on a real tank, it would have landed on the engine deck. 8 gunners achieved 2 hits. These were the naturals, the ones who immediately grasped the spatial relationships involved. Kozlowski watched each shot carefully, taking notes, providing correction. You're compensating too much for the angle, trust the trajectory. The rocket will drop naturally, you don't need to aim as high as you think. Your assistant needs to brace the rear of the tube when you're firing at this angle. The recoil is different. Watch the target's movement for 3 seconds before you fire. Learn the rhythm of how it's moving. By the end of the second day, 34 qualified gunners understood the technique well enough to employ it in combat. More importantly, they believed in it. That was the real transformation. Not just the technical skill, but the psychological shift from viewing bazookas as nearly useless against German armor to understanding that they had a weapon that could genuinely threaten tanks. Colonel Tuttle attended the final hour of training, watching silently as the last student teams took their shots. Afterward, he pulled Kozlowski aside. "Corporal, I'm putting you in for a Silver Star. Captain Morrison will handle the paperwork. What you've accomplished here, both the combat achievement and the training, represents exactly the kind of innovation we need." "Thank you, sir." "How many tanks do you think the Army can kill if this technique spreads beyond V Corps? If every infantry division adopts it?" Kozlowski considered the question carefully. "The technique doesn't work in all terrain, sir. Flat ground, desert conditions, any environment without natural elevation won't provide the necessary firing positions, and it requires training time that not all units will have. But in European terrain, against German armor with properly trained gunners, I estimate it could triple the effective anti-tank capability of standard infantry squads." "Triple?" Tuttle repeated. "Do you understand what that means strategically? We've been losing men because infantry couldn't stop armor. Now they can. You've changed the tactical equation." "I just noticed something other people hadn't noticed, sir." "That's what innovation is, Corporal, noticing what others miss." By January 15, 1945, the high-angle bazooka technique was being taught at infantry training facilities across the European theater of operations. By February 1st, it was part of official U.S. Army doctrine. By March, German armor commanders were reporting increasing casualties from American bazooka teams and recommending tactical countermeasures that included avoiding elevated terrain when possible and maintaining suppressive fire on any elevated positions overlooking armored maneuver routes. The impact was measurable. In December 1944, before Kozlowski's technique became widespread, American bazooka teams in the European theater achieved approximately 127 confirmed tank kills with an estimated 3,800 rockets fired, a 3.3% kill rate. In February 1945, after technique standardization, American Bazooka teams achieved approximately 441 confirmed tank kills with an estimated 4,200 rockets fired, a 10.5% kill rate. 3 times more effective. Exactly as Kozlowski had predicted. The technique wasn't universal. Many situations still called for standard sidearmor engagement, and many terrain types didn't provide elevated positions. But whenever elevation was available and tactics permitted, American infantry now had a reliable method for killing German tanks with weapons they carried as standard equipment. The psychological impact mattered as much as the tactical impact. American infantry stopped fearing German armor as an unstoppable force. They started actively hunting tanks, selecting positions specifically to enable high-angle shots, coordinating with artillery and armor to drive German tanks into terrain that exposed their vulnerable rear decks. German tank casualties from bazooka fire increased so dramatically that some German commanders began requesting infantry support for all armored operations, specifically to suppress potential elevated bazooka positions. A significant drain on infantry resources that would otherwise have been employed in offensive operations. Henry Kozlowski, meanwhile, returned to 3rd Squad and continued doing what he'd always done: observing, calculating, fighting. He took 14 more high-angle shots between December 28th and the end of January. 12 hits, 10 kills, 2 disablements. His final confirmed total: 17 German tanks destroyed, 5 disabled. 22 armored vehicles removed from combat by one man with a weapon everyone had said didn't work against German armor. The definitive demonstration of the technique's value came on January 28, 1945, during an action near the German border that later became a case study at the Army's infantry school. 3rd Squad, now reinforced back to full strength and considered one of the most effective anti-tank units in the regiment, was assigned to defend a critical crossroads near the village of Huningen. Intelligence indicated that German forces were planning a counterattack aimed at relieving pressure on their defensive lines near the Siegfried Line. The crossroads represented a key junction. If the Germans took it, they could threaten the flank of the American advance. Baker Company was ordered to hold the crossroads. 3rd Squad was positioned on a steep hillside overlooking the only road the Germans could use for armored approach, a narrow valley road that climbed gradually toward the crossroads. Perfect terrain for high-angle engagement. Kozlowski spent 2 hours preparing the position. He identified 3 separate firing positions, each at different elevations and angles covering different sections of the approach road. He pre-calculated ranges to key terrain features. He positioned sandbags and logs to create stable firing platforms at each location. He briefed his assistant loaders on the exact sequence they'd follow: fire from position 1, displace to position 2 while reloading, fire again, displace to position 3. They called it shoot and scoot, a tactic designed to prevent German counter-battery fire from eliminating them after the first shot. Captain Morrison visited the position at 2:00 p.m., 4 hours before the expected German attack. Cause intelligence says we might see up to a company of armor. That's 10 to 15 tanks. You ready for that? Yes, sir. The valley road forces them into a channelized approach. They can't spread out, can't maneuver laterally. They have to come up that road in column formation. Perfect target environment. You'll be their priority target once you start shooting. Yes, sir. That's why we have 3 positions prepared. After each shot, we displace before they can get fires on our location. What if they bring infantry to clear the hillside? That's 3rd Squad's job, sir. My team focuses on armor. The rest of the squad covers us from infantry assault. Morrison nodded, satisfied. I'm putting a lot of faith in your technique, Corporal. If this doesn't work, if those tanks get through, they'll have a clear shot at the entire company position. It'll work, sir. The Germans came at 6:17 p.m. just as the winter sun was setting and shadows were lengthening across the valley. 13 Panzer IVs advancing in column up the narrow road, turrets traversing as they searched for threats. Behind them, mechanized infantry in half-tracks, probably 2 platoons worth. Kozlowski waited at his first firing position, a natural shelf of rock about 30 feet above the road, partially concealed by pine trees, watching the column advance. Range to the first tank, 180 yards. Range to the last tank, 320 yards. He'd let them close to 120 yards before engaging. That would put the lead elements well into the kill zone and make the trailing tanks bunch up when the lead was hit. 150 yards. 130 yards. At 125 yards, Kozlowski fired. The rocket streaked down from the elevated position, its motor trail clearly visible in the dimming light. The German tank commander probably saw it, probably tried to maneuver, but there wasn't time. The rocket impacted the rear engine deck at a 42-degree angle, penetrated the ventilation system, and detonated inside the engine compartment. Flame erupted from the Panzer's rear deck. The tank lurched, stopped, began burning. Kozlowski and his loader were already moving, covering the 20 yards to position 2 while a second loader team prepared the next rocket. German response was immediate and intense. 5 tanks targeted the hillside where Kozlowski had fired, pumping high-explosive shells into the position. Trees shattered, earth exploded, but Kozlowski wasn't there anymore. He was at position 2, 40 yards west, aiming at his second target. The German column had stopped, tanks trying to maneuver in the narrow confines of the valley road. Confusion spreading as commanders tried to identify where the threat was coming from while dealing with the burning wreck blocking the road. Kozlowski fired again. Second rocket, second tank. Different angle, 38 degrees this time, slightly steeper because position 2 was higher. Same result, penetration, engine fire, catastrophic kill. Now the Germans knew they were facing elevated fire. Their tactics shifted immediately. Tanks began firing suppressive rounds at every elevated position on the hillside. Machine guns raked the tree line. The infantry dismounted from their half-tracks, beginning to advance up the hillside to clear whatever American positions were causing this damage. But Kozlowski was already at position 3. And the other members of 3rd Squad were doing their jobs. Automatic weapons fire cutting into the advancing German infantry, forcing them to seek cover, slowing their assault. Third shot from position 3, 60 yards south of his original position at the highest elevation point they'd prepared. Range to target, 145 yards. Angle, 47 degrees. The rocket hit a Panzer at the center of the German column. Engine fire, kill. 3 tanks destroyed in 4 minutes. The German advance had become a disaster. 13 tanks had entered the valley. 3 were burning wrecks blocking the road. The remaining 10 were trapped in a narrow channel, unable to maneuver, taking fire from an elevated position they couldn't effectively suppress because the American team kept moving. The German company commander made the right decision: withdraw. The column reversed, leaving the burning tanks, falling back down the valley road to regroup and develop a different approach. 3rd Squad held the crossroads. One American squad, armed with bazookas and standard infantry weapons, had stopped a German armored company. That night, Captain Morrison radioed the battalion commander with a simple situation report. Enemy armored attack repelled, minimal friendly casualties. Kozlowski technique validated under optimal conditions. Recommend immediate recognition. The Silver Star came through in February. The citation read, "For gallantry in action against an armed enemy, Corporal Henry Kozlowski demonstrated exceptional courage and tactical ingenuity in developing and employing innovative anti-tank techniques that resulted in the destruction of 17 enemy armored vehicles and the successful defense of critical terrain objectives. His actions directly contributed to the defeat of enemy offensive operations and prevented significant American casualties." Kozlowski accepted the medal without ceremony or celebration. He'd done what needed doing. The recognition felt unnecessary, though he understood it mattered to the Army. The military institution needed heroes, needed stories of innovation and success to boost morale and validate tactical decisions. The technique he developed mattered more than any medal. By war's end, an estimated 801,000 German armored vehicles were destroyed by American bazooka teams employing high-angle engagement tactics in European terrain. The technique spread beyond infantry units to engineers, reconnaissance teams, and even artillery forward observers who found themselves in elevated positions with bazookas. The German army adapted, developing countermeasures, avoiding elevated terrain when possible, employing heavy suppressive fire against suspected elevated positions, coordinating armored advances with aggressive infantry screening. But the adaptation came too late and cost too much. German armor was already overstretched and undersupplied, and every additional tactical complication reduced their operational effectiveness. Henry Kozlowski himself continued fighting through the end of the war. He participated in the final advance into Germany, the crossing of the Rhine, the push toward the Elbe River. He took 18 more high-angle bazooka shots during these operations, achieving 14 hits and 11 confirmed kills. His final verified total, 28 German armored vehicles destroyed. No other single bazooka gunner in the European theater achieved more than 7 confirmed kills. He was offered a battlefield commission in March 1945. The Army wanted to make him a lieutenant, put him in charge of training programs, turn him into an official expert on anti-tank tactics. He declined. Sir, I'm not an officer. I'm a soldier who figured out how to make a weapon work better. Making me an officer doesn't change that. They promoted him to sergeant instead and left him with 3rd Squad, where he continued doing what he'd always done: observing, calculating, fighting when necessary. After the war ended, the Army's Ordnance Department conducted a comprehensive study of bazooka effectiveness in the European theater. The study analyzed thousands of engagement reports, interviewed hundreds of soldiers, and attempted to determine why the weapon's performance improved so dramatically in the final months of the war. The conclusion was unambiguous. The adoption of elevated firing positions and top attack profiles against engine deck armor, as pioneered by Sergeant Henry Kozlowski, 38th Infantry Regiment, 2nd Infantry Division, represented the single most significant tactical innovation in American anti-tank infantry doctrine during the European campaign. The study's authors noted several contributing factors to the technique's success. First, it exploited a genuine weakness in German armor design. Tank designers focused armor protection on frontal and side surfaces, where most combat occurred. Engine deck armor was necessarily thin to allow heat dissipation, and ventilation systems created unavoidable vulnerabilities. Second, it matched the terrain conditions of European combat. Hills, urban structures, and uneven ground were common throughout France, Belgium, and Germany, environments that naturally provided elevation advantages if soldiers knew how to exploit them. Third, it required minimal specialized equipment. Unlike other anti-tank systems that needed rare ammunition or specialized training, the high-angle technique used standard bazookas and standard rockets, employed by standard infantry squads. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, it changed infantry psychology. By giving infantry a reliable method for killing tanks, it transformed them from victims of armored warfare into active participants. The study concluded with a recommendation: all future anti-tank training should emphasize elevated firing positions and top attack profiles as primary techniques, with traditional side armor engagement taught as secondary alternative. The Army accepted the recommendation. Post-war bazooka development focused on weapons optimized for steep-angle fire. The Super Bazooka, introduced in 1945, included improved sights designed specifically for high-angle engagement. Training films demonstrated elevated firing techniques. Infantry manuals were rewritten to emphasize the importance of selecting positions with vertical advantage. The technique Kozlowski had developed through observation and practice became official doctrine. Henry Kozlowski mustered out of the Army in October 1945, returning to Allentown, Pennsylvania with a Silver Star, 2 Purple Hearts from wounds he'd barely mentioned to anyone, a combat infantryman badge, and a collection of notebooks filled with trajectory calculations and engagement notes. He returned to the steel mills. Not because he lacked options. Several veterans organizations offered him positions. A military contracting firm wanted to hire him as a consultant, and the Army tried multiple times to convince him to join the National Guard with a guaranteed officer commission. But Kozlowski was never interested in being anything other than what he was: a man who showed up, did the work, solved problems when he noticed them. He spent 32 years working at Bethlehem Steel, eventually becoming a shift supervisor not through ambition, but through the simple fact that people respected his judgment and deferred to his experience. He married in 1947, raised 3 children, lived quietly in the same neighborhood where he'd grown up. He rarely talked about the war. When pressed, usually by curious nephews or neighborhood kids who'd heard stories, he'd offer simple factual descriptions. I was in the infantry. We fought in Belgium and Germany. I worked with bazookas mostly. The legend didn't need his participation to grow. Veterans who'd fought alongside him told stories. Officers who'd studied his technique wrote articles for military journals. Training films featured recreations of his engagements. By the 1960s, Kozlowski's top attack method was being taught to infantry officers at Fort Benning as a case study in tactical innovation. The man himself remained unimpressed by his own mythology. In 1964, a military historian tracked him down for an interview, hoping to write a book about his wartime service. Kozlowski granted one meeting, answered questions politely but tersely, and declined to participate further. "There's nothing to write about," he told the historian. I noticed that tanks had thin armor on top and that hills let you shoot down at tanks. That's not complicated. Any soldier who paid attention would have noticed the same thing eventually. I just noticed it first. But you took that observation and developed it into a reliable technique, the historian protested. That's innovation, that's tactical genius. It's just problem solving. You see a problem, you think about solutions, you test the solutions until one works. That's not genius, that's just work. The historian never wrote the book. But the legend persisted anyway, told and retold by soldiers who understood that what Kozlowski had done mattered not because it was complicated, but because it was practical. Because it saved lives. Because it proved that observation and persistence could matter as much as formal training and official doctrine. Henry Kozlowski died in 1993, at age 72, from complications related to a lifetime of heavy industrial work. His obituary in the Allentown Morning Call mentioned his military service in a single paragraph. During World War II, Kozlowski served with distinction in the 2nd Infantry Division, earning the Silver Star for actions in Belgium and Germany. No mention of the technique he'd pioneered. No mention of the 28 tanks he'd destroyed. No mention of the lives he'd saved by teaching other soldiers how to fight back against armor they'd thought was invincible. But at Fort Benning, Georgia, where the Army trains its infantry officers, there's a memorial to him. Not a statue or monument, Kozlowski wouldn't have wanted that, but something more practical. A permanent training demonstration range designed to teach high-angle anti-tank engagement. The range features elevated firing positions overlooking target areas where instructors teach the technique he developed 80 years ago. Above the entrance to the range, there's a simple plaque. KOZLOWSKI range, dedicated to Sergeant Henry Kozlowski, 2nd Infantry Division, who proved that observation matters more than rank, that practical experience matters more than doctrine, and that one soldier with an idea can change how armies fight. Modern soldiers train there without knowing Kozlowski's full story. They learn the technique elevated positions, steep angles, engine deck targeting, as if it's always been part of infantry doctrine. They don't know that before December 1944, the Army considered bazookas nearly useless against German armor. They don't know that one soldier changed that assessment through observation and practice. But the technique works, still works. Even with modern anti-tank weapons, the principle Kozlowski identified remains valid. Attacking armor from above where protection is thinnest provides significant tactical advantage. The weapons have changed, the technology has evolved, but the fundamental insight endures. And that's the real legend. Not the story of a hero who performed impossible feats through supernatural skill or legendary courage, though Kozlowski had courage in abundance. But the story of a soldier who noticed something, thought carefully about what he'd noticed, tested his ideas systematically, and persisted until he proved those ideas worked. The story of how observation, patience, and practical intelligence can matter more than formal training, official doctrine, or institutional authority. The story of how one man, armed with a weapon everyone said didn't work, proved them wrong not through argument or rhetoric, but through results that no one could dispute. 28 German tanks destroyed. Hundreds of American lives saved. An entire tactical doctrine transformed. All because Henry Kozlowski, ammunition loader from Allentown, Pennsylvania, refused to accept that the problem couldn't be solved. In military academies today, instructors still teach the Kozlowski principle, the concept that vertical advantage in anti-tank warfare can compensate for limitations in weapon penetration capability. Modern anti-tank guided missiles employ top-attack profiles as standard feature, striking armor from above where protection is weakest. Attack helicopters position themselves for top-down engagement. Infantry anti-tank teams are trained to seek elevation whenever possible. The technology has become sophisticated beyond anything Kozlowski could have imagined in 1944. Thermal sights, laser rangefinders, computerized ballistics, precision-guided munitions. Modern anti-tank warfare bears little resemblance to a man with a bazooka firing at steel monsters from a frozen Belgian hillside. But the principle remains the same. Attack from above, target the vulnerable systems, use terrain to create advantage. Simple, practical, effective. In 2019, during a training exercise at Fort Benning, a young infantry officer asked his instructor about the origin of the high-angle engagement doctrine they were learning. The instructor told Kozlowski's story, abbreviated, simplified, but accurate in its essentials. "So one guy just figured this out on his own," the officer asked, "and now it's how everyone fights." That's how most tactical innovations happen, the instructor replied. Someone sees a problem differently, tests an idea, proves it works, then everyone else adopts it and forgets it was ever controversial. Was he some kind of genius? The instructor shook his head. Read his after-action reports, read his training notes. He was just thorough, patient, willing to observe carefully and think about what he observed. Those aren't genius traits, they're work traits. Anyone can develop them. But most people don't. No, the instructor agreed. Most people don't. That's what made Kozlowski special, not supernatural ability, but consistent attention to details everyone else ignored. The training continued. The young officer learned to calculate angles and ranges, to select firing positions, to coordinate with assistant loaders and supporting elements. He learned the technique that Kozlowski had pioneered. But he also learned the deeper lesson. That innovation comes from observation, that doctrine evolves through practical experimentation, and that one person who refuses to accept limitations can change how entire armies operate. That lesson matters more than any specific technique. Because weapons will continue to evolve, armor will continue to advance, tactical situations will continue to change. But the principle behind Kozlowski's achievement, careful observation, systematic testing, persistence in the face of skepticism, remains eternally relevant. No one ever doubted the bazooka again. Not after Third Squad, Baker Company proved that the impossible was merely the untested. And not after Henry Kozlowski, steelworker from Pennsylvania, demonstrated that the perfect shot doesn't always come from a textbook angle. Sometimes it comes from a frozen hillside in Belgium, 47 degrees from horizontal, aimed at a vulnerability everyone else had missed. His technique was simple. His results were undeniable. His legacy endures in every soldier who learns that observation matters more than rank, that practical experience trumps official doctrine, and that one person with an idea can change how wars are fought.